For the past year, my neighbor, Janet, has treated our HOA like her personal fiefdom. She'll take photos of your lawn if it's too long, report you for trash bins being out 10 minutes late, and even measure our Christmas lights to see if they were in compliance. Last month, she fined me $50 for having my garage door open while I was unloading groceries. That was the last straw. So I decided, if she loves rules so much, she's going to live and die by them. Let me paint you a picture of Willowbrook Gardens, our supposedly charming suburban neighborhood. It's one of those cookie-cutter developments where every house looks like it was spawned from the same architectural fever dream: beige siding, black shutters, and lawns maintained with military precision. Well, most lawns anyway. I'm Mike, 34, software engineer, and I bought my house here 3 years ago because it was affordable and close to work. Big mistake. What the realtor called well-maintained community standards was actually code for prepare to live under the iron fist of Janet Morrison, HOA board vice president and self-appointed neighborhood patrol captain. Janet is 52, works in accounting somewhere, and has the kind of personality that makes you understand why some animals eat their young. She moved here 7 years ago and within 6 months had somehow maneuvered herself onto the HOA board. Since then, she's made it her life's mission to ensure that every blade of grass, every mailbox number, and every outdoor light fixture adheres to the Byzantine web of rules that govern our little slice of suburban hell. Let me give you some examples of Janet's greatest hits. The Great Trash Can Incident of 2023. My neighbor Bob, a 67-year-old retiree, had the audacity to put his trash cans out at 6:45 p.m. on Sunday instead of the required 7 p.m. Janet happened to be on her evening patrol. Yes, she actually patrols the neighborhood with a clipboard and measuring tape, and documented this grievous violation with 17 photographs from different angles. Bob got a $25 fine and a strongly worded letter about maintaining community standards. The Lawn Length Inquisition. Janet carries a ruler. An actual ruler. She's been known to march onto people's property and measure grass height to ensure it doesn't exceed the HOA mandated 2.5 inches. My next-door neighbor Sarah got fined $75 because a patch of her lawn measured 2.7 inches after she went out of town for a week. Janet's evidence packet included not just photos, but actual measurements with timestamps. The Christmas light Gestapo. Last December, Janet went full Grinch on the neighborhood. She measured everyone's Christmas lights to ensure they didn't exceed 150 feet total per house. Yes, that's a real rule buried on page 47 of our HOA guidelines. She filed complaints against 8 families. 8. One family had their lights up for exactly 361 hours, which violated the maximum 360-hour display period rule. Janet had been tracking this with a spreadsheet. The mailbox font fiasco. Janet noticed that the Williams family had replaced their house numbers with slightly different font. Same color, same size, just a different typeface. She filed a complaint claiming it violated the uniform aesthetic standards and forced them to replace the numbers with HOA-approved fonts. This cost them $200 in new numbers plus a $50 fine for the violation. The garden gnome controversy. Mrs. Chen, an 82-year-old widow, had a small garden gnome in her flower bed. Janet determined this violated the no non-plant decorative items and landscaping rule and forced her to remove it. When Mrs. Chen argued that her late husband had given her the gnome, Janet's response was, "Community standards don't make exceptions for sentimental value." The woman is relentless. She's got this whole system set up. She takes her patrol walks twice daily, maintains detailed files on every house in the neighborhood, and has memorized the HOA rulebook like it's some kind of holy text. She's the kind of person who probably reminds teachers about homework assignments and counts change twice at grocery stores. But here's the thing that really gets me. Janet acts like she's doing us all a favor. She'll tell you with a straight face that she's maintaining property values and preserving our community's character. She's convinced herself that she's some kind of neighborhood superhero, when really she's just a busybody with too much time and an unhealthy obsession with other people's business. The HOA board president Tom, who's basically checked out, treasurer Linda, who just nods and agrees with whatever Janet says, and secretary Dave, who's clearly terrified of her, just goes along with whatever Janet wants. She's turned what should have been a simple community organization into her personal kingdom, and the rest of us are just unwilling subjects. The incident that broke the camel's back. So here's what finally pushed me over the edge. It was a Saturday morning in late October, perfect fall weather, and I was doing what any normal human does on the weekend, unloading groceries from my car. I had my garage door open because, it's easier to carry bags straight into the garage than around to the front door. I'm making multiple trips, carrying bags of groceries, when I noticed Janet standing at the edge of my driveway with her phone out, clearly taking photos. At first, I thought maybe she was documenting some violation at another house, maybe someone had a leaf out of place or something equally earth-shattering. But no. She was photographing my open garage door. "Excuse me," I called out, setting down my groceries. "Can I help you with something?" Janet didn't even look embarrassed. "I'm documenting a violation of HOA Regulation 4.2.7c, she said, still snapping photos. "Garage doors are not permitted to remain open for extended periods unless actively engaged in vehicular maintenance or storage activities." I stared at her. "I'm unloading groceries." "The regulation doesn't specify grocery unloading as an acceptable activity," she replied, consulting her ever-present clipboard. "Your garage door has been open for approximately 12 minutes. The maximum allowable time for non-maintenance activities is 10 minutes. You timed me?" "I maintain detailed logs of neighborhood activities to ensure compliance," she said matter-of-factly. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the board." I looked at this woman, this actual human being, who had apparently spent her Saturday morning timing how long my garage door was open, and felt something snap inside my brain. "Janet, I'm literally just bringing groceries into my house. This is insane." "The rules apply to everyone equally," she said, snapping one final photo. "Community standards exist for a reason." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in my driveway holding a bag of frozen peas and questioning my life choices. 3 days later, I got the letter. A formal HOA violation notice for unauthorized extended garage door usage, with a $50 fine and a warning that future violations could result in escalated enforcement actions. The letter included 4 photos of my garage door from different angles, timestamps, and a detailed explanation of which specific regulation I had violated. $50 for unloading groceries. That night, as I sat in my living room staring at this absurd fine, something occurred to me. If Janet was so obsessed with rules and regulations, if she knew the HOA guidelines so well that she could cite specific subsections from memory, then surely she must be following every single rule herself, right? I mean, someone who finds neighbors for grass that's 0.2 inches too long wouldn't possibly be committing any violations herself. Someone who measures Christmas lights with a tape measure and tracks garage door opening times with a stopwatch must have a perfectly compliant property. Right? That's when I decided to find out. The research phase, down the rabbit hole. I spent the next 2 weeks diving deep into our HOA's governing documents, and let me tell you, it was like discovering a hidden world of bureaucratic insanity. Our community guidelines aren't just rules, they're a 127-page masterpiece of obsessive micromanagement that covers everything from approved dog breeds to the acceptable angle for holiday flag displays. I started by downloading every document from our HOA's website. The original covenants, the amended bylaws, the architectural guidelines, the landscape standards, and something called the Community Harmony Manual that I'm pretty sure Janet wrote herself. I printed everything out and spent my evenings reading through it with highlighters and sticky notes, like I was studying for the bar exam. Here are some of the gems I discovered. Section 3.4.2. Address numbering standards. House numbers must be clearly visible, consistently sized, and mounted at regulation height between 48 to 52 inches from ground level. The numbers must be maritime blue or charcoal black, and use only approved serif or sans serif fonts. They must be cleaned monthly and replaced immediately if showing visible wear, fading, or damage. Section 7.1.8. Refuse container protocols. Trash and recycling containers can only be placed curbside between 6 p.m. the evening before collection and 8 p.m. the day of collection. Containers must be positioned wheels toward the house, handles toward the street, and placed no closer than 3 feet from mailboxes, fire hydrants, or vehicles. Section 5.6.3. Seasonal decoration guidelines. Halloween decorations cannot be displayed more than 30 days before October 31st and must be removed within 48 hours of November 2nd. Christmas decorations cannot be displayed before November 15th or after January 15th. All decorations must be tasteful, weather-appropriate, and consistent with community aesthetic standards. Section 9.2.1. Vehicle parking standards. No commercial vehicles, recreational vehicles, boats, trailers, or motorcycles may be parked in driveways or streets overnight. All vehicles must be moved at least once every 72 hours to prevent stagnant parking violations. Section 4.7.4. Landscaping maintenance requirements. All planted areas must be weed-free, properly mulched, and maintained in a neat and orderly fashion. Mulch must be refreshed annually and cannot exceed 3 inches in depth. Dead plants must be removed within 7 days of visible decline. But here's where it got really interesting. Buried in the appendices, I found the enforcement procedures. Apparently, any HOA member can file a formal complaint by submitting a violation report form with photographic evidence and detailed descriptions. The board is required to investigate all complaints within 15 business days and issue fines for confirmed violations. The key word there is required. They don't get to pick and choose which violations to care about. If someone submits a proper complaint with evidence, they have to act on it. I also learned that board members aren't exempt from the rules. In fact, Section 12.3.7 states that board members are expected to serve as exemplars of community standards and may face enhanced penalties for violations, up to and including removal from the board for repeated infractions. Enhanced penalties. For repeated infractions. Removal from the board. Now I was getting excited. I decided to start my surveillance mission casually, just observing Janet's property during my normal daily activities. I'd walk my dog past her house, check my mailbox at strategic times, and maybe take a slightly longer route when driving to work. What I discovered was beautiful. Janet, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood perfection, was a walking violation factory. The documentation project. Over the next 3 weeks, I became Janet's shadow. Not in a creepy way, I was just more observant of her activities and more aware of her property when I happened to be in the area. And holy hell, was she giving me material to work with? Violation 井号1, address number positioning. Janet's house numbers were mounted at 46 inches from ground level. The regulations clearly state 48 to 52 inches. I measured this during an evening walk, using the app on my phone that measures distances. I took photos from multiple angles, including one with a measuring tape discreetly positioned in the frame. Violation number 2. Unauthorized seasonal decorations. On October 2nd, a full 29 days before Halloween, Janet had a small decorative scarecrow on her front porch. The regulations allow Halloween decorations starting 30 days before October 31st, which would be October 1st. She was 1 day early. 1 day. I photographed it with timestamps. Violation 井号3, refuse container protocol violation. This was the golden ticket. On Wednesday, October 18th, I happened to be walking my dog at 6:47 p.m. when I noticed Janet putting her trash cans out. But here's the kicker, she placed them wheels toward the street, handles toward the house. The exact opposite of the regulation. I got clear photos showing the incorrect positioning. Violation number 4, landscaping maintenance violation. Janet had 3 dead marigolds in her front flower bed that had been there for at least 10 days. I know because I started photographing her landscaping daily once I noticed them declining. The regulations require dead plants to be removed within 7 days. I had a complete photographic timeline showing the progression from wilting to completely dead. Violation number 5, vehicle parking violation. Janet's Honda Civic hadn't moved from the exact same spot in her driveway for 6 days straight. I know because I started noting the position of her car during my dog walks, and it was in the identical position each time, same angle, same distance from the garage, even the same small oil stain underneath. The regulations require vehicles to be moved every 72 hours. Violation 井号6, mulch depth violation. During one of my walks, I noticed Janet's front landscaping had mulch that looked suspiciously thick. I managed to discreetly measure it using a stick and found several areas where the mulch exceeded 4 inches in depth. The maximum allowed depth is 3 inches. But the best was yet to come. Violation number 7. Christmas decoration early display. On November 12th, 3 days before the allowable date of November 15th, Janet put up a small wreath on her front door. It was subtle, just a simple autumn wreath with tiny pine cones, but it was clearly a Christmas decoration. It had a red ribbon and small holly berries. I photographed it from the street with a clear timestamp. Violation number 8. Address number cleanliness. Remember how the regulations require house numbers to be cleaned monthly? Well, Janet's numbers had visible dirt and what looked like bird droppings on them. They looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months. I got close-up photos showing the grime. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. This woman, who had fined me for having my garage door open for 12 minutes, was violating multiple regulations herself. The same person who measured my Christmas lights with a tape measure had put up her decorations 3 days early. The woman who timed my trash can placement had positioned her own cans incorrectly. I was documenting everything meticulously. Each violation got its own folder with photos, measurements, timestamps, and references to the specific regulation being violated. I was building a case that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. But I knew I needed to be strategic about this. If I submitted all the complaints at once, it might look like harassment. If I spaced them out too much, some of the time-sensitive violations might become moot. I needed a plan. The strategic assault. I decided to launch my campaign in phases, starting with the most clear-cut violations and building momentum. My goal wasn't just to get Janet fined. I wanted to demonstrate to the HOA board that their enforcement system was being weaponized by a hypocrite who couldn't follow the very rules she was forcing on everyone else. I started with violations that were absolutely indisputable and had clear photographic evidence. Complaint number 1, address number height violation. Date submitted, November 15th. Violation. Section 3.4.2, house numbers mounted at 46-inch instead of required 48 to 52. Evidence. 6 photos from different angles, measurements using phone app, reference ruler in frame. Status. Submitted with formal violation report form. Complaint number 2, refuse container positioning violation. Date submitted, November 18th. Violation. Section 7.1.8, trash containers positioned wheels toward street instead of toward house. Evidence. 4 photos showing incorrect positioning, timestamp showing violation occurred during regulation placement window. Status. Submitted with formal violation report form. I submitted these through the proper channels, filling out the official forms, providing detailed descriptions, including all photographic evidence, and citing the specific regulation numbers. I was professional, thorough, and completely by the book. The HOA board's response was swift and predictable. Within a week, I received acknowledgement letters confirming that my complaints had been received and were under investigation. 2 weeks later, Janet received official violation notices for both infractions, along with fines totaling $75. I know this because Janet, in her infinite wisdom, decided to confront me about it. She showed up at my front door on a Tuesday evening, holding her violation notices and practically vibrating with rage. "Did you file complaints against me?" she demanded without any preamble. "Hello, Janet," I said calmly. "I'm fine, thanks for asking. How are you?" "Cut the crap, Mike. I know this was you. Nobody else would waste time measuring house numbers." I shrugged. "I'm just doing my civic duty to maintain community standards. The rules apply to everyone equally, right? That's what you told me when you fined me for unloading groceries." Her face went through several shades of red. "This is different. These are minor technical violations." "So was my garage door," I replied. "But you still fined me $50 for it. That was a legitimate safety concern. And your house numbers being 2 inches too low could be a legitimate emergency response concern. What if paramedics can't find your house because the numbers aren't at regulation height?" She stared at me like I'd just spoken in ancient Sumerian. "You can't be serious. I'm as serious as you were when you timed my garage door opening, I said. The community standards exist for a reason, Janet. I'm just helping ensure they're enforced fairly. She stormed off, muttering something about harassment and getting lawyers involved. I closed the door and allowed myself a small smile. This was going exactly as planned. Over the next month, I continued my documentation and submitted complaints at a steady pace, not so fast as to seem harassment, but consistent enough to create a pattern. Complaint number 3, landscaping maintenance violation. Date submitted, November 22nd. Violation, Section 4.7.4 dead plants not removed within 7-day requirement. Evidence, 12 photos showing progression of plant decline over 10-day period. Fine issued, $50. Complaint number 4, vehicle parking violation. Date submitted, December 3rd. Violation, Section 9.2.1, vehicle not moved for 6 consecutive days. Evidence, 8 photos over 6 days showing vehicle in identical position, oil stain evidence. Fine issued, $100. Complaint number 5, seasonal decoration violation. Date submitted, December 5th. Violation, Section 5.6.3, Christmas decorations displayed 3 days before allowable date. Evidence, 5 photos with clear timestamps showing wreath installation. Fine issued, $75. By this point, Janet had racked up $300 in fines, and I was just getting warmed up. The HOA board was dutifully processing each complaint and issuing the required notices and fines. They had to, their own procedures required it, and I was following the process to the letter. Phase Sun, the acceleration. January brought new opportunities. Janet, clearly frustrated by the constant violations, seemed to be getting careless. Or maybe she was just so used to being the enforcer that she'd never bothered to actually follow the rules herself. Complaint number 6, mulch depth violation. Date submitted, January 8th. Violation, Section 4.7.4 mulch exceeding 3-inch maximum depth. Evidence, 7 photos showing measurements of mulch depth in various locations. Fine issued, $50. Complaint number 7, address number cleanliness violation. Date submitted, January 15th. Violation, Section 3.4.2, house numbers not maintained in clean condition. Evidence, 4 close-up photos showing dirt, grime, and bird droppings on numbers. Fine issued, $25. Complaint number 8, holiday decoration overage. Date submitted, January 18th. Violation, Section 5.6.3, Christmas decorations not removed within required timeframe. Evidence, 3 photos showing wreath still displayed on January 17th. Deadline was January 15th. Fine issued, $75. The beautiful thing about this system was that each violation was completely legitimate. I wasn't making anything up or exaggerating. I was simply holding Janet to the exact same standards she had been enforcing on everyone else. Every rule I cited was one that she had used against other neighbors. Every fine I triggered was calculated using the same fee schedule she had applied to others. By the end of January, Janet had accumulated $525 in fines and was officially classified as a repeat offender under HOA guidelines. More importantly, several neighbors had started to take notice. The neighborhood awakens. Word was spreading through Willowbrook Gardens, and not just about Janet's mounting violations. People were starting to realize that someone was finally holding her accountable, and the response was interesting. It started with Bob, the elderly retiree who'd been fined for putting his trash cans out 15 minutes early. He stopped by my house one evening in late January. "Mike," he said, grinning like a kid who'd just discovered his teacher's first name, "I heard through the grapevine that Janet's been getting some violation notices of her own." "Really?" I replied innocently. I hadn't heard. "Come on," he laughed. "The whole neighborhood knows it's you. That woman has been terrorizing us for years, and suddenly she's getting a taste of her own medicine? That's not a coincidence." I shrugged. I just believe in consistent enforcement of community standards. "Well, whoever's doing it," Bob said with a wink, "they're doing God's work." That woman fined me for my trash cans being out 15 minutes early, and now I hear she's been cited for putting hers in the wrong position entirely. Word was definitely getting around. Over the next week, I had similar conversations with Sarah, the lawn-length victim, the Williams family, mailbox font controversy, and even Mrs. Chen, garden gnome casualty. Everyone was in remarkably good spirits. But the real confirmation that my campaign was having an impact came from an unexpected source: the HOA board meeting minutes. HOA board meetings are supposed to be open to all residents, and the minutes are supposed to be posted on the community website. I'd never bothered reading them before, but I started checking them regularly to see how the board was handling the influx of violation reports. The January meeting minutes were fascinating. Board member Morrison raised concerns about what she termed frivolous and retaliatory violation reports being filed against her property. She noted that the volume of complaints against her residents has increased significantly and suggested that the board consider implementing screening procedures for violation reports to prevent harassment. President Torres let the community input continue for about 15 minutes before calling for order. The message was unmistakable. Janet had created a culture of zero tolerance and nitpicky enforcement, and the community was tired of it. "Thank you for the input," Torres said. "The board will take all comments into consideration." "Janet, do you have any response to the concerns raised?" Janet stood up again, and I could see her hands shaking slightly. "I understand that some residents may feel that enforcement has been strict, but my job as a board member is to maintain community standards. These violations against me are clearly retaliatory and—" "Janet," Martinez interrupted, "I'm looking at the photographic evidence for your violations, and they appear to be just as legitimate as the ones you've documented against others. For example, your address numbers are clearly mounted below the required height. Your trash cans were photographed in the wrong position. Your Christmas decorations were up 3 days early. These aren't subjective interpretations, they're factual violations of clearly written rules." Dave nodded. "And the timeline of violations suggests this isn't about 1 or 2 mistakes. This is a pattern of non-compliance spanning several months." Torres consulted his notes. "Janet, under Section 12.3.7 of our bylaws, board members who accumulate pattern violations may be subject to removal proceedings. You've now exceeded the threshold with verified violations totaling $1,175 in fines." "You can't be serious," Janet said, her voice rising. "You're going to remove me from the board because of harassment complaints filed by vindictive neighbors?" "We're considering removal because you've violated community standards repeatedly while simultaneously enforcing those same standards inflexibly against others," Torres replied. "The board position requires credibility and fair application of rules." Martinez added, "Janet, you've personally told multiple residents that rules are rules and that personal circumstances don't matter when it comes to violations. How can we maintain that standard while making exceptions for your violations?" Janet looked around the room at the sea of faces, neighbors she had fined, criticized, and harassed for years. The same people who were now watching her be held to the standards she had imposed on them. "I want to request a continuance," she said finally. "I need time to prepare a proper defense." Torres shook his head. "This isn't a trial, Janet. This is a review of documented violations and your fitness to serve as a board member. The violations are factual and verified. The question is whether someone who can't follow the rules themselves should be in a position to enforce them against others." The vote. Torres called for a motion regarding Janet's board position. Martinez immediately moved to remove Janet from the board for pattern violations inconsistent with board member standards and credibility requirements. Dave seconded the motion. Since Janet couldn't vote on her own removal, it came down to the 3 remaining board members. "All in favor of removing board member Morrison from her position?" Torres asked. 3 hands went up. It was unanimous. Janet sat in stunned silence for a moment, then gathered her papers and walked out of the meeting without saying another word. The room erupted in scattered applause, which Torres quickly shut down, but the mood was unmistakable. The neighborhood tyrant had been dethroned. The aftermath, a new regime. The immediate change in the neighborhood was remarkable. Without Janet's daily patrol routes and obsessive documentation, enforcement became much more reasonable and focused on actual problems rather than technical violations. The new board approach was dramatically different. When they replaced Janet with a neighbor named Tom Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, who had moved into the neighborhood recently, the first thing they did was review and revise the enforcement policies. They implemented what they called common sense guidelines, a policy that violations would be evaluated based on intent, impact, and reasonableness rather than purely technical compliance. Minor technical violations would result in friendly notices and reasonable correction periods rather than immediate fines. They also established an appeal process, so residents could contest violations they felt were unreasonable. And they created a policy requiring board members to recuse themselves from enforcement activities if they had any personal conflict with residents. Most importantly, they reduced the fine schedule. The old system that Janet had championed included fines ranging from $25 to $500 for various violations. The new system focused on warnings and education first, with fines reserved for serious or repeated violations. Janet's transformation. Here's where the story gets really interesting. About 6 months after her removal from the board, something unexpected happened. Janet actually apologized. I was working in my front yard when she walked over from her house. This was the first time she'd approached me since her confrontation at my door months earlier. Mike, she said, looking genuinely uncomfortable, I owe you an apology. I set down my gardening tools and looked at her. Oh. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I think you were right. I was being hypocritical. I was enforcing rules on everyone else that I wasn't even following myself. This was not what I expected. What brought this on? She sighed. Honestly, living under the enforcement system I created. Getting fined for things like address number, height, and trash can positioning made me realize how ridiculous some of these rules are when they're applied without any common sense. It's funny how perspective changes when you're on the receiving end, I said. It really does, she admitted. I convinced myself that I was protecting property values and community standards, but really I was just being a bully, making people's lives harder for no good reason. We talked for about 20 minutes, and I have to say, it was like talking to a completely different person. The woman who had timed my garage door opening and measured my Christmas lights was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely remorseful about her behavior. I know I can't undo the fines I issued or the stress I caused people, she said, but I want you to know that I've learned from this experience. You held up a mirror and showed me what I had become, and I didn't like what I saw. The long-term impact. It's been over a year since Janet's removal from the board, and Willowbrook Gardens has become a genuinely pleasant place to live. The HOA still enforces important standards. They'll still cite you for major violations like leaving trash everywhere or painting your house neon green, but they've stopped the petty harassment that made everyone's life miserable. Property values have actually increased since the enforcement changes, which kind of undermines Janet's whole argument about strict rule enforcement being necessary for maintaining home values. Turns out people are willing to pay more to live in a community where they won't get fined for having their garage door open too long. Janet herself has become a model neighbor. Her property is well maintained and fully compliant with all HOA regulations, but she's stopped patrolling the neighborhood looking for violations. She's even started participating in community events again, something she had stopped doing when she was focused entirely on enforcement. The new board has found a much better balance. They handle legitimate issues promptly and fairly, but they don't measure grass with rulers or time garage door openings. They've managed to maintain community standards without making everyone feel like they're living in a police state. Looking back on this whole experience, I learned several important things. Documentation is everything. When dealing with bureaucratic systems, having thorough, factual documentation makes your case unassailable. I couldn't have succeeded without carefully photographing and measuring every violation. 2. Rules apply equally or they don't apply at all. The credibility of any enforcement system depends on consistent application. When enforcers exempt themselves from the rules they impose on others, the entire system becomes illegitimate. 3. People in power often don't realize how they're using that power until they experience the system from the other side. Janet genuinely seemed to believe she was helping the community until she experienced her own enforcement methods as a recipient. For sometimes the best way to change an unjust system is to make it apply to the people who created it. I didn't break any rules or do anything unethical. I just ensured that the rule enforcer was subject to the same scrutiny she imposed on others. 5. Community support matters. Once other neighbors realized what was happening, they rallied to support the effort. Janet's removal wasn't just about my complaints. It was about a community that was tired of unreasonable enforcement and ready for change. The most satisfying part wasn't the revenge, though that was admittedly sweet. It was watching our neighborhood transform from a place where people were afraid to put up Christmas decorations or let their grass grow slightly too long into a place where people actually talk to each other and work together to maintain reasonable community standards. Janet learned that rules without reason become tyranny. The community learned that they don't have to accept unreasonable authority figures just because those people happen to be in positions of power. And I learned that sometimes the best way to fight bureaucratic bullying is with bureaucratic precision. Update, 6 months later. I thought I'd add a quick update since this post got so much attention and people have been asking for follow-up information. Janet is doing well. She's still living in the neighborhood and we've actually developed a cordial relationship. She occasionally asks for advice about HOA compliance, which is hilariously ironic, and she's become much more reasonable in her interactions with neighbors. The HOA board has continued to function well under the new enforcement philosophy. They've had to issue exactly 3 fines in the past 6 months, all for legitimate violations like leaving boats parked on the street for weeks or failing to maintain landscaping to the point where it was affecting neighboring properties. Several neighbors have told me that they've started actually reading the HOA guidelines, which has resulted in better voluntary compliance rather than fear-based compliance. When people understand the reasons behind rules and trust that enforcement will be fair, they're more likely to follow them willingly. Property values in our neighborhood have increased by an average of 8% over the past year, according to recent sales data. Turns out that reasonable community management is more attractive to potential buyers than tyrannical rule enforcement. And yes, I still unload my groceries with my garage door open. Nobody times me anymore. The comments section. Top comment, Jiangbei Gold Award, 2.3K upvotes. U/property lawyer TX. As someone who represents HOAs professionally, this is exactly how these situations should be handled. Board members who create hostile enforcement environments often have no idea how their own policies feel when applied to them. Your documentation was perfect, professional, factual, and unassailable. Well played. U/retired teacher _Bob. I'm actually Bob from this story. Mike gave me permission to comment. Can confirm everything Mike wrote. Janet was absolutely horrible to deal with, and the change in our neighborhood has been incredible. We went from people being afraid to put up decorations to having actual community events again. U/HOA survivor in 2019. I went through something similar with our board treasurer who was embezzling funds while fining people for minor violations. Sometimes you have to beat the system with its own rules. Great job documenting everything. U/legal eagle _. This is malicious compliance at its finest. OP didn't break any rules, didn't harass anyone, and didn't do anything unethical. They simply ensured that the rule enforcer was subject to the same standards they imposed on others. Perfect execution. Yo, Sarah next door. I'm Sarah from the story. Mike is being modest about how bad Janet was. She made our lives miserable for years. The woman literally carried a ruler to measure grass height. A ruler. I can't thank Mike enough for what he did. U/Mrs. 82. This is Mrs. Chen. Janet made me remove my husband's garden gnome, but now we're friends. She apologized and even helped me plant new flowers last month. People can change when they realize how their actions affect others. U/HOA board member. I'm Dave from the board, Mike said I could comment. What Mike didn't mention is that Janet had been getting increasingly difficult to work with even before this happened. She was micromanaging everything and making board meetings miserable. Her removal was necessary for the board to function normally. U/Justice served until 2024. The fact that she tried to claim harassment while she had been harassing neighbors for years is just chef's kiss. Some people have zero self-awareness until reality smacks them in the face. U/Suburban and Survivor. Reading about Janet's violations made me check my own HOA compliance. Turns out my house numbers were the wrong font and I had no idea. Fixed them before anyone noticed. Sometimes these stories are educational. Yo, Micah. Thanks for all the support, everyone. I never expected this post to blow up like this. Just goes to show that people everywhere are dealing with overzealous HOA enforcement. The key is documentation and persistence. You can't argue with facts. Final statistics. Total violations filed against Janet, 18. Total fines assessed, 1,425美元. Time from first complaint to board removal, 4 months. Neighbors who participated in filing complaints, 8. Board meeting attendance for removal hearing, 37 residents, previous record was 9. Change in neighborhood satisfaction surveys, plus 47% improvement. Change in property values, plus 8% average increase. Number of fines issued in the 12 months since Janet's removal, 3, compared to 87 the previous year. Sometimes the best revenge is simply holding people to their own standards. Janet created a system of rigid rule enforcement without mercy or common sense, and when that system was applied to her with the same inflexibility she had shown others, it couldn't survive the scrutiny. The neighborhood is better for it, Janet is better for it, and I got to learn more about HOA regulations than any reasonable person should ever know. Win-win-win. Edit. Since people keep asking, yes, I still have all the documentation and photos. No, I won't share them publicly since they include personal information. And yes, Janet and I are genuinely friendly now. She's actually a decent person when she's not drunk on HOA power. Edit 2. For those asking about legal implications, everything I did was completely within the HOA's own procedures and guidelines. I didn't trespass, didn't harass anyone, and didn't fabricate any violations. I simply documented actual rule violations and reported them through official channels. Multiple lawyers in the comments have confirmed that this approach is legally sound. Edit 3. Some people are asking if I feel bad about getting Janet removed from the board. Honestly? No. She created a hostile environment that made everyone's life worse, and she showed no mercy or understanding when enforcing rules against others. She got exactly the treatment she had been giving everyone else. The fact that she learned from the experience and became a better neighbor is just a bonus. The moral of the story: if you're going to enforce rules inflexibly against others, you'd better be prepared to live by those same rules yourself. Community standards work best when they're applied fairly and reasonably by people who understand that they apply to everyone, including the enforcers. Thanks for reading. This experience taught me that sometimes the most effective way to change an unjust system is to make it apply equally to everyone, especially the people who created it. Reminded the board that all violation reports must be processed according to established procedures regardless of who files them or who they target. He noted that the reported violations appear to be legitimate and properly documented. Treasurer Martinez pointed out that board member Morrison has previously advocated for strict enforcement of all community standards, and that consistent application of rules is essential for maintaining the integrity of the HOA's authority. Board member Morrison requested that she be allowed to abstain from voting on her own violations. President Torres ruled that this was already standard procedure and that she had never been asked to vote on her own cases. Discussion was tabled pending legal consultation on harassment policy. Legal consultation on harassment policy. That was interesting. It suggested that Janet was pushing back hard against the enforcement actions and maybe even threatening legal action. But it also showed that the rest of the board wasn't backing down. I decided it was time to accelerate the timeline. The Blitz. February was when I really opened up the throttles. I had been documenting violations for months, and I'd built up a significant backlog of legitimate complaints. It was time to unleash them. Complaint number 9, unauthorized commercial vehicle. Date submitted, February 2nd. Violation, Section 9.2.1, landscaping company truck parked in driveway overnight. Evidence. Photos showing commercial vehicle parked from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. Fine issued, $150. This one was perfect because Janet had previously reported 3 neighbors for having work trucks in their driveways overnight. The violation was exactly the same. A landscaper had left his truck at her house and it stayed overnight. Complaint number 10. Unapproved landscaping modification. Date submitted, February 5th. Violation. Section 4.3.1 Installation of decorative border stones without architectural approval. Evidence. 6 photos showing new stone border around flower bed. Fine issued, $200. Complaint number 11. Mailbox post deterioration. Date submitted, February 8th. Violation. Section 3.5.2 Mailbox post showing visible wear and weather damage not addressed within 30-day notice period. Evidence. Photos showing peeling paint and rust stains. Previous photos establishing 30-plus day timeline. Fine issued, $75. Complaint number 12. Improper waste material storage. Date submitted, February 12th. Violation. Section 7.3.4 Garden waste and leaf bags stored visibly in front yard for more than 24 hours. Evidence. Time-stamped photos over 3-day period showing bags in same location. Fine issued, $50. Complaint number 13. Address lighting malfunction. Date submitted, February 15th. Violation. Section 3.4.5 Required address lighting not functional during evening hours. Evidence. Photos taken after dark showing non-illuminated house numbers. Fine issued, $75. Complaint number 14. Seasonal color scheme violation. Date submitted, February 18th. Violation. Section 5.1.3 Valentine's Day decorations displaying non-approved color combinations. Evidence. Photos showing bright purple and orange heart decorations. Approved colors are red, pink, white only. Fine issued, $50. By mid-February, Janet's total fines had reached $1,175. More importantly, she had received what the HOA calls a pattern violation notice, a formal warning that she was approaching the threshold for potential board review and removal proceedings. The pattern violation notice is triggered when a board member accumulates more than $1,000 in fines within a 12-month period. It requires the affected board member to appear before the full board, excluding themselves, to explain the violations and demonstrate corrective action. Janet's pattern violation hearing was scheduled for the March board meeting. The community rallies. By this point, my little campaign had taken on a life of its own. What started as personal revenge against Janet's hypocritical enforcement had become something of a neighborhood movement. Other residents started paying attention to the HOA rules and, more importantly, to Janet's compliance with them. I wasn't the only one filing complaints anymore. Sarah, who'd been fined for her grass being 0.2 inches too long, submitted a complaint about Janet's sprinkler system creating puddles on the sidewalk, a clear violation of Section 8.2.1 regarding water waste and pedestrian safety hazards. The Williams family, still bitter about the mailbox font incident, filed a complaint about Janet's porch light being the wrong color temperature. It was bright white LED instead of the required warm white specification in Section 3.4.6. Even Mrs. Chen got into the action, filing a complaint about Janet's garbage disposal practices after discovering that she was putting recyclables in regular trash bags, a violation of Section 7.2.3. The most beautiful part was watching Janet try to defend herself using the same arguments that she had dismissed when neighbors used them against her violations. When she was cited for the sprinkler puddles, she argued that it was just a minor technical issue, and that the intent of the rule was to prevent excessive water waste, not to penalize small maintenance issues. When she was fined for the wrong color porch light, she claimed that the difference between warm white and cool white is subjective and not clearly defined in the guidelines. When she was cited for the recycling violation, she insisted that enforcement should focus on major violations that actually impact property values, not minor infractions that don't harm anyone. Sound familiar? These were exactly the arguments that neighbors had made to her over the years, and she had rejected every single one. She had been absolutely inflexible about rule enforcement when she was the one doing the enforcing. But now that she was on the receiving end, suddenly the rules were too strict and enforcement was unreasonable. The cognitive dissonance was beautiful to watch. The March Board Meeting Showdown. The March HOA Board Meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on the third Tuesday of the month, held in the community clubhouse. Normally, these meetings attracted maybe 5 or 6 residents, usually just people with specific complaints or requests. This meeting had 37 people in attendance. Word had gotten out that Janet's pattern violation hearing was on the agenda, and apparently half the neighborhood wanted to watch the show. I arrived 20 minutes early and still had trouble finding a seat. The meeting started with routine business: approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, discussion of pool maintenance for the upcoming season. Janet sat at the board table looking increasingly uncomfortable as more and more residents filed into the room. Finally, President Torres called for the pattern violation hearing. Board Member Morrison, you've been issued a pattern violation notice due to accumulating more than $1,000 in violation fines over the past 12 months. The purpose of this hearing is to review your violations, discuss corrective actions, and determine if any board action is warranted. Janet stood up, clearly prepared with notes and arguments. President Torres, I want to state for the record that I believe these violations are the result of a targeted harassment campaign designed to undermine my position on this board. A murmur went through the room. Several neighbors exchanged glances. Torres consulted his paperwork. The record shows 14 separate violations filed by 6 different community members over a period of 4 months. Each complaint was properly documented, investigated, and confirmed. Can you explain how these constitute harassment rather than legitimate enforcement of community standards? The violations are technically correct, Janet admitted, but they represent an unreasonable interpretation of regulations that are normally enforced with discretion and common sense. Treasurer Martinez leaned forward. Janet, I have your enforcement history here. Last year alone, you filed 43 violation complaints against neighbors. Of those, 37 were for what you categorized as technical but important standards violations. Can you explain why discretion and common sense should apply to your violations but not to those you've reported against others? Janet's face was getting red. That's different. I was enforcing legitimate violations that actually impacted community standards. Secretary Dave, who usually said nothing at board meetings, actually spoke up. Janet, looking at your complaint history, you fined Bob Henderson for having his trash cans out 15 minutes early. You fined the Chin family for having a garden gnome. You fined Mike Patterson for having his garage door open while unloading groceries. How are those violations more legitimate than yours? The room was dead silent except for the sound of Janet shuffling through her notes. Furthermore, Martinez continued, several residents have reached out to express concerns about what they perceive as overly aggressive enforcement under your oversight. We've received multiple complaints about your enforcement methods being, quote, intimidating and unreasonable. Torres nodded. Janet, the board has to consider whether your approach to rule enforcement is consistent with our community's values and whether your own compliance issues undermine your credibility as an enforcement authority. Janet tried to rally. I've been serving this community for 7 years. I've maintained property values and community standards that benefit everyone here. These violations are minor technical issues being blown out of proportion by people who resent appropriate enforcement. That's when Bob Henderson stood up in the audience. Excuse me, President Torres, can residents speak during this hearing? Torres looked uncertain. This is a board disciplinary matter, but I suppose brief community input would be appropriate. Bob stepped forward. I just want to say that Janet fined me $25 because my trash cans were out 15 minutes early. 15 minutes. When I tried to explain that I had to leave early for a medical appointment, she told me that community standards don't make exceptions for personal circumstances. Now she's asking for discretion and common sense for her own violations. I think that's pretty hypocritical. Sarah raised her hand. Can I speak too? Without waiting for permission, she continued. Janet made me pay $75 because my grass was 2/10 of an inch too long after I came back from visiting my sick mother. She told me that property maintenance was my responsibility regardless of personal circumstances. Now she wants us to consider intent and reasonableness for her violations. Where was that consideration for the rest of us? Mrs. Chun stood up slowly. Janet made me remove a garden gnome that my late husband gave me. When I explained the sentimental value, she said community standards don't make exceptions for personal feelings. But now she's asking us to make exceptions for her because she thinks her violations are different. One by one, more neighbors stood up to share their experiences with Janet's enforcement. The Williams family talked about the mailbox font incident. Another neighbor described being fined for having Christmas lights up one day past the deadline because of bad weather. Someone else talked about being cited for having a work truck in their driveway while contractors were fixing their roof. The pattern was clear. Janet had been absolutely inflexible and unsympathetic when enforcing rules against others, but expected understanding and discretion when those same rules were enforced against her. For more stories, please check out our channel. Thank you.